Hello everyone, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0. Welcome back to the channel. Enjoy the fanfic. And let's begin. Part 3. Hokage-sama, Uzumaki-san and his teammate are here to see you. Tsunade glanced up to see Hagane Katetsu standing in the doorway. The Chunin looked a little more disheveled than usual, almost as if he'd been forced to dodge attacks from a raging academy student. Send them in. He bowed and opened the door a little wider to allow the genin to walk and roll into the room. She noticed with some interest that Tayuya and Katetsu held a brief glaring match on the way in. Knowing the girl's uncanny knack for rubbing people the wrong way, it was obvious that the two had gotten into an altercation shortly before entering. "Oi, Blondie," Tayuya yelled, turning her attention away from the angry Chunin. "You need to keep your lackeys in line before they get hurt." The Hokage gave the grumbling young man a questioning look, but didn't press the matter. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand and turned to glance at the clock hanging above the entrance to her office. They were 5 minutes early, but she more than welcomed the distraction from signing off on paperwork. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a large manila envelope. The folder was easily 3 inches thick, and it looked to be barely holding in the massive amount of paper inside. It was almost hard to believe that every single sheet of paper in the folder pertained to the fiery redhead waiting impatiently in front of her desk, the majority of it documenting her switch from a prisoner to a Konoha ninja. After finding what she was looking for, she lifted her eyes to address the genin in front of her. "Naruto, you might want to take a seat. Since you two are early, you'll have to wait a few minutes for Jiraiya to get here. He knows more about this mission than I do," she said, motioning towards one of the chairs resting against the wall. When she'd become the Hokage, Tsunade had completely remodeled the office. Gone were the old, hardwood chairs and drabby atmosphere that used to permeate the room. The walls were now painted a bright peach, and dark green curtains hung from the open sliding door behind her. She'd redone the carpeting too, going with a deep forest green to complement the walls and hide the stains that would undoubtedly be brought in by especially reckless shinobi. Miniature trees sat in every corner of the office, each resting next to a large, comfortable plush chair. Naruto pulled one of the chairs from the corner closest to him and set it down next to Tayuya. When he was situated, the redhead let out a very unladylike snort. "Where is he, anyway? I'd like to see the guy that Orochimaru bitches about on a daily basis." At that moment, a large puff of smoke appeared directly in front of them. The smoke soon cleared to reveal a large orange and blue frog, Jiraiya standing proudly on its head. Did someone mention Mayuboku Mountain's monk of the frog spirits, the great toad hermit Jiraiya? He yelled, one hand extended out in front of him for dramatic effect. Tayuya slowly turned to stare at Tsunade with a deadpan expression. "You're sending us on a 3-year mission with him?" she asked, her voice remaining emotionless. Naruto pat her on the shoulder and shook his head with understanding. "Don't worry, you'll get used to him eventually." The girl shot him a disbelieving glare. "If I ever get used to a guy like this, please lodge the sharpest kunai you have into my eye socket." Tsunade stifled a giggle at Jiraiya's downtrodden expression. The last person to blatantly insult her former teammate so harshly had been Naruto, as most people were too afraid to say something bad about one of the legendary Sannin. After recovering from his momentary depression, the man dismissed his summon and hopped onto the Hokage's desk. "Nay, Tsunade Hime, can you speed this up? I have more important things to do than explain to a couple of brats what's going to happen in the next few years. They'll find out eventually, right?" he said, reaching for her emergency bottle of sake. She smacked his hand away from the hidden compartment with a scowl. "No, we can't. This mission briefing is as much for me as it is for them. I need to know everything you're going to be doing, and why you're going to do it." The man rolled his eyes. He turned his attention to the redhead currently glaring burning daggers at him. "Before I tell you anything, Does she know about Naruto yet? Tsunade nodded. Yes, she found out this morning shortly after he woke up. She doesn't seem to have any problems with it. Jiraiya grinned and sat up straight. Ah, that makes things so much easier. His face suddenly became deathly serious, causing Tayuya to blink in surprise. He didn't look anything like the lecherous fool she initially took him for. The main reason for this mission is to help Naruto learn to use Kyuubi's chakra so that he can defend himself against the Akatsuki. My sources tell me that they're not going to move for a few years, so that gives me plenty of time to get him ready. The girl perked up at this bit of information. Akatsuki? She questioned, ing her head to the side. The other three shinobi lifted their eyebrows in surprise, and Tsunade leaned forward to study the girl's expression more closely. They're a group of rogue ninja trying to collect the 9 Biju. You've heard of them. Tayuya looked up at the ceiling in thought. Someone had mentioned them, but who? Orochimaru used to be a part of the group, if that helps, Jiraiya added. She snapped her fingers and smiled. That's it. Yeah, I remember those now. 2 of them tried to attack Orochimaru once while we were escorting him to the Wind Country. If the Siamese twins hadn't summoned Rashomon to help us get away, we would have had our asses handed to us in no time. The Toad Sanin pulled a notebook and pencil from a pocket in his vest. Do you remember who they were? She nodded and held up 2 fingers. If they were going to give her legs, she didn't mind giving them a little information in return. The first one was a tranny or something. He threw these little spider bombs at us, and they hurt like shit if they exploded on your skin. The weirdest thing was that he had ing mouths in his hands. Bastard probably used them to give himself a blowjob, she said as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Naruto choked on his own spit at her choice of words. His face began to turn red from lack of oxygen, and Tayuya had to smack him on the back a few times to keep him from dying. What about the second one? Tsunade asked, holding in her own smirk. Things were never boring when the redhead was involved. Dunno. He was ing around with Orochimaru while we took on Bomberman. All I remember is that he was fat and had a long ass tail. Jiraiya nodded and slipped his notebook back into his vest. He looked thoughtful for a few seconds before nodding to himself again and sat up a little straighter. I don't know who the second guy is, but based on your description, the first one is Deidara of the Hidden Rock. He's an S-class missing nin who specializes in clay-based projectile bombs. Tsunade glanced worriedly at her surrogate little brother. If people like that were after Naruto, it might not be such a good idea to send him on a dangerous training mission outside of the village walls. As if reading her mind, her teammate interrupted her thoughts. I can assure you that keeping him within the village walls won't do much for his safety. Itachi and Kisame, the 2 Akatsuki members assigned to capture Naruto, have already penetrated these walls once. If they wanted to, they could easily do so again. She sighed and nodded her agreement. She knew he was right, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Tayuya shifted around in her wheelchair impatiently. Yeah, that's great and all, but what about my legs? When are you gonna fix them? Jiraiya laughed at her eager expression, causing the girl to scowl and flip him off. Actually, we can do the ceiling later this morning. I've already completed the scrolls needed to perform the ritual, and drawn most of the chakra-mediating seals in the main operating room. However, before we can do anything, 2 conditions have to be met, he replied. Tayuya narrowed her eyes suspiciously. What kind of conditions? Tsunade sighed and rubbed a tired hand through her hair. The first is that Naruto will have to contribute some of his chakra in order for the Sozo Seisei to have enough power to work. While I'm sure that he would be more than willing to help, this technique requires a lot more chakra than even Naruto, Jiraiya and I have at our disposal. Basically, he'll have to tap into Kyuubi's chakra. The girl snorted. So, I've still got Orochimaru's dirty chakra in me, what harm could a little bit of Kyuubi's do? Tsunade shook her head. That's just it. We don't know what effects his chakra would have on a normal human's body, let alone a body already infected with Orochimaru's chakra. In short, the process could potentially kill you. The room was silent. Everyone's eyes rested on Tayuya, but her hair covered whatever emotions were crossing over her face in reaction to the news. If you want, I can give you some more time to think about it. That. The Hokage lifted an eyebrow in mild surprise. Excuse me, I said, that. I don't need any time to decide. Dying is better than spending the rest of my life as a paraplegic. I'm a young shinobi. What the hell kind of life would I lead if I couldn't beat the shit out of other people? She said with a slightly maniacal grin. Tsunade smiled wryly. You haven't heard the second condition yet, she reminded the girl. The redhead stared at her disbelievingly. What could possibly be worse than being told that you might get blown up from the inside by demon chakra? Sighing, the woman laced her fingers in front of her nose. This was the hard part. In order for me to give you your legs back, the village council insists that I put a tracking seal somewhere on your body until you've proven yourself thoroughly trustworthy. If you decide to run, she said, lowering her gaze to meet the girl's, the seal allows us to immediately teleport to your position and kill you. Up until now, Naruto had been quietly observing the conversation. However, the mention of someone killing one of his friends was not something that sat well with the genin. Nani? What the kind of bullshit decision is that? What if someone decides to find and kill her just because she's from the sound? He snarled, shooting up from his chair and slamming his fists on the desk. Tsunade frowned up at him disapprovingly. Don't you think I've considered that, brat? The only two people who will be able to use this seal will be Jiraiya and myself. She flicked his forehead, sending him flying back into his chair. Remember your place, Naruto. Even though I let you get away with a lot, I'm still the Hokage, and you will show me the proper respect. He frowned angrily but nodded his understanding anyway. He knew she was already bending over backwards to help them, but it still didn't make him any less upset. Gomen, Oba-chan, the boy muttered. She nodded and looked at the girl staring thoughtfully at her hands. After a couple minutes of silence, Tayuya slowly looked up at Tsunade with a shockingly bone-chilling expression. It was a mix between hope and desperation, along with a lot of pain and distrust swirling around behind it. It honestly gripped at her heart to see such a scary emotion flickering across the normally angry girl's face, and for the first time, she wondered exactly what had happened in her life to warrant such a despondent look. If I take the seal, how do I know you won't just kill me when you're tired of having me around, or when you can't use me anymore? She whispered, lowering her head again. Naruto stared over at her with disbelief. This was definitely not the girl he'd met over a week ago at the border to the Sound Country. That girl had been boastful and proud, with a little craziness thrown in for taste. The girl sitting to his left almost reminded him of himself. The Hokage stood from her seat behind the large oak desk and walked around it until she was standing directly in front of Tayuya. She knelt down to her eye level and smiled. Not everyone is like Orochimaru, Tayuya. I know it might be hard to believe right now, but please give us a chance to prove to you that we would never harm you for such a groundless reason. You're a shinobi of the leaf, isn't it my duty as the Hokage to protect and help you as much as I can? The redhead turned her eyes away from Tsunade's. Orochimaru said the same shit when he asked me to join the Sound. What makes you any different? The woman chuckled lightly at her question. Well, for one, I don't look like a snake. Tayuya smirked from under her long locks of hair. She definitely had a point there. And, I haven't turned you over to the interrogation and torture department like I would most other prisoners. Instead, I'm giving you a whole new chance at life by healing your legs and allowing you to train yourself to become a powerful kunoichi of the leaf. What reason would I have to kill you after going through so much trouble to help you live? Her smile widened slightly as she looked up at the Hokage. While she barely trusted the woman or the Leaf Village on her own, she did trust Naruto. If he trusted the two legendary Sannin with his life, then by association, so would she. Fine, I'll do it. But if you betray me, I'll come back as a ghost and haunt your ass until you gouge your own eyes out with a teaspoon. She turned and pointed at Jiraiya. That goes for you too, Froggy. Naruto laughed at her nickname for his sensei. Froggy was probably the last thing that would have crossed his mind when referring to the perverted toad hermit. You don't have to worry about me, kid. I have enough living women haunting me than I care to admit. Tsunade rolled her eyes and picked up the envelope containing Tayuya's paperwork. Since the jutsu is basically a regenerative technique, there's no need for you to spend any significant amount of time recovering in the hospital. In fact, you can leave for your mission as early as next week if you so choose. Her teammate nodded his agreement. The sooner the better. There's no telling exactly what day the 3 years will be up, and we need all the time we can get. The woman picked up her lab coat and tossed it on over her robe. I'll go down to the operating room to make sure everything is in order. She glanced up at the clock. Amazingly, over half an hour had passed since the genin had arrived. It's 9:30 right now, be down at the hospital in an hour, and we'll begin the sealing process. Jiraiya, come with me to make sure that none of the seals have been tampered with. He hopped off the desk and followed her out of the door, leaving the teens alone in the office. Standing up and stretching, Naruto gripped the handlebars of her wheelchair and leaned over to look at her face. So, where to? Tayuya watched the number of bowls pile up on the countertop with mild awe and amusement. They'd only been at Ichiraku Ramen for 20 minutes, and Naruto had somehow managed to put away a whopping 13 bowls of noodles. She was convinced that if it wasn't for the 30-second wait between servings, he'd already be up to 20. Shit, forget what she said about him matching Jirobu's maximum stomach capacity. When it came to ramen, he downright crushed the pose-sized boy. She glanced at her own measly 4 bowls and sighed. Where the did he put it all? Would you like another bowl? A feminine voice asked, interrupting her thoughts. She snapped her head around to see the owner's daughter smiling cheerfully down at her from behind the counter. Hell no, I don't think I could even look at another bowl of ramen right now. The young woman laughed. It was shrill like most civilian girls. Then again, she never paid much attention to civilians in the first place, but instead had a comforting tone to it, much like the old man in the restaurant. Still, 4 bowls is pretty impressive. Our other customers order an average of 2 bowls at the most. At this bit of information, she felt her eyeballs pop out of their sockets. That meant that Naruto ate 7.5 more bowls than the average person. She briefly wondered if he was eating for himself and the Kyuubi. A sudden image of a pregnant Naruto popped into her mind, making her smirk and shake her head. She really needed to keep her mind from wandering. You know, you're one of the few people who come here willingly with Naruto. Usually he has to drag his friends here, and even then they barely eat 1 bowl, just to make him happy. She lifted a curious eyebrow at the girl. One of the few. Ayame nodded and leaned forward against the counter. The only people who really seem to enjoy coming here with Naruto are Iruka-san and Hinata-san. Tayuya froze at the mention of another girl. Naruto had never mentioned a Hinata. Then again, the only people he ever really mentioned were his teammates, his former teachers, and the people he beat in a fight. It was very possible that the boy had a whole bunch of other friends and family that she didn't know about, like the group who came to visit him in the hospital. She watched him vigorously tear into his 16th bowl and sighed. Somehow, she doubted that. Hinata? She asked, trying not to sound too interested. The waitress briefly smirked and nodded again. He's only brought her here a handful of times, but she seemed to really enjoy his company. The redhead narrowed her eyes in thought. She was pretty curious about this, Hinata. There must be something wrong with her if she actually enjoyed spending time with him. She does. She doesn't talk much when I ask her stuff, so I figured she didn't really like being around me. The kunoichi jumped slightly in surprise. He was so enthralled in his ramen that she didn't think he'd actually be paying attention to the conversation. Sometime during their short talk, he had raised the total number of bowls eaten devoured to 18. She's just a little shy around you, Naruto-kun, Ayame said with a grin. He gave her a confused look and edged his head to the side. Why? Tayuya fought the urge to slam his head into the countertop. He had to be the densest guy on the planet. Still, the waitress just winked and walked towards the curtain leading to the back of the restaurant. I wonder. She giggled lightly as the curtain closed behind her. Seeing that he wasn't going to get any answers out of her, he turned to address the only girl left in the restaurant. Nay, Tayuya, do you know? She shook her head. It wasn't a total lie, as she honestly didn't know why the girl was so shy around him. It was only a very plausible and likely idea. Nope. I've never met the bitch, so I couldn't tell you what her problem is. He nodded and smiled. You're right, you haven't met her. Maybe I should introduce you to her after you get your legs back. A mischievous grin slowly made its way onto her face. That was a great idea. She could see who this girl was, and rub it in her face that she would be spending 3 years with the girl's crush. There was nothing she enjoyed more than stepping on the hopes and dreams of another person. That'd be great. I can't wait to meet her. She exclaimed, trying her best not to sound too enthusiastic. Naruto's smile widened into his trademark foxy grin. He was glad that she would be making more friends besides him, and Hinata was the perfect choice. Little did he know that what she had in mind was the exact opposite. Anyway, we only have 25 minutes left until we have to go back to the hospital. Are you ready? She nodded, and after Naruto paid for both of their meals, Gama-chan would need a refill when he got home. She lifted her arm to be picked up. Although it was a little unnerving how quickly she had gotten used to it, she'd actually started to enjoy being picked up whenever she wanted. It kind of reminded her of when she was younger, before Naruto, before the Sound 4, even before Orochimaru. Sighing, she realized that this would probably be the last time he'd ever do this. It seemed as if he noticed this too, as he briefly hesitated before fully setting her down the chair. Thanks. Naruto pulled back in surprise. After the dozens of times he'd moved her to and from her wheelchair, this was the first time she had actually thanked him for it. Nani? She avoided his gaze and shrugged. You know, for helping me out. Since this is the last time and all. I'll either have my legs back, or I'll be dead, so. He frowned down at her. You'll definitely get your legs back. It's a promise of a lifetime, and I never go back on my word. She almost pointed out that the last time he'd made that promise he had failed, but decided against it. It wouldn't do to jinx herself, after all. But, don't worry about it. I kind of liked it. When she lifted a suspicious eyebrow, he quickly corrected himself. You know, like, hanging out with you. Guess we'll be doing a lot more of that for the next 3 years, huh? Tayuya smirked up at him. Yeah, I guess we will. As he slowly wheeled her towards the hospital, neither one spoke for fear of ruining the pleasant atmosphere that had settled around them. Are the preparations in place? Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Shizune all stood in the large hospital operating room. Intricate seals and symbols littered the floor, forming a winding spiral leading to a series of scrolls spread out in the center. Each roll of paper contained another set of complex symbols, looking very much like a bunch of random strokes of paint. The toad hermit wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and nodded. I did most of this last night, and it doesn't take long to prepare a few scrolls to mediate chakra. The Hokage smiled. Thanks for doing this. I know it couldn't have been easy to research and paint so many different seals. Nah, it wasn't that hard. I just modified the original design of your seal and shortened the duration a bit. She raised a questioning eyebrow. Shortened the duration? He slowly raised his arms to stretch. Yeah, your seal draws upon the chakra that you've stored up until it runs out. Since she doesn't have the chakra stored up to maintain the jutsu, it will automatically stop when we cut off the chakra flow into her body. I've also added a function that allows her to cancel the jutsu if she ever decides to use it in the future. Tsunade pouted playfully. That means hers is more efficient than mine. Jiraiya giggled. No, I think yours are much more efficient than hers will ever be, he leered with a perverse grin. She scowled and punched him on top of the head. Baka hentai. She glanced over at her apprentice standing by the doors to the operating room. Shizune. Bring them in. Hi, Tsunade-sama. The young woman replied. She bowed slightly and slipped out of the dark room. A few minutes later, she returned with a nervous-looking Naruto and Tayuya in tow. They were dressed in identical hospital gowns, although the redhead had a medical cap covering her hair to reduce the risk of something interfering with the seal. The Hokage motioned for them to bring the girl over. How are you feeling? Do you still want to go through with this? It's not too late to change your mind. Tayuya snorted and put on a weak smile. Hell no, I'm more than ready for this. The woman smiled down at the girl with a small bit of respect. It wasn't easy to accept an operation that only had around a 50% chance of success. Alright, remove your gown and we'll get started. Both genin froze. What? She shrieked, recoiling with surprise. Tsunade frowned. The gown will just get in the way of the seal. If you're worried about Naruto seeing you, she said with a small grin, I'll give you a sheet to cover yourself with. Tayuya sighed and shot Naruto a glare that clearly stated, peek and I'll shove a kunai up your virgin ass. He gulped and quickly turned around. After Tsunade set her down in the center of the spiral, the girl easily loosened the string holding her gown together and pulled the flimsy garment off of her body. Shizune rushed over with a sheet and draped it over her more important parts. Jiraiya tapped the boy on shoulder and pointed towards the edge of the spiral. Alright, Naruto, take a seat and we'll get started. He nodded and plopped down in his designated position. Tsunade and Jiraiya did the same, forming a simple triangle around Tayuya. A long line of seals led from their positions to the center of the spiral where the girl lay. The man formed a few seals and looked up at Naruto and his teammate. Are you ready? They too formed the same seals and nodded. He took a deep breath and slammed his hands onto the edge of the spiral simultaneously with the others. A bright flash of blue light briefly illuminated the dark room before slowly ebbing into a faint glow. The chakra visibly lit up each individual symbol painted on the ground, causing the seal to squirm and slowly slide counterclockwise towards the center. Tayuya visibly flinched from the pain, immediately worrying Naruto. What's wrong? He asked, gazing over at her in concern. She turned her head to smile weakly at him. Nothing, just stings a little. Orochimaru's seal was way more painful. He nodded, but continued to frown. They hadn't mentioned that the sealing would be painful, although it did kind of make sense. When Orochimaru had used the Gogyu Fuin in the Forest of Death to seal the Kyuubi's chakra, the pain had been strong enough to knock him unconscious. He also remembered the pain Sasuke seemed to feel when he unwillingly received the Heaven Seal. Naruto turned to look at his sensei. What's happening? The seal is gradually implanting itself into her body. When we can no longer see the spiral, the process will be complete, Jiraiya informed him. His student nodded in understanding. He could feel his chakra slowly trickling away from his body, and although he knew he had more chakra than even most Junin, it wouldn't be long before he had to rely on the Kyuubi. 30 minutes into the sealing, Tsunade finally began to show signs of fatigue. She was fighting to keep her hands pressed together in concentration, but it was obvious that it was an uphill battle. The seal was a little over half complete, and if Jiraiya and Naruto couldn't come up with the second half of the chakra, the entire operation would fail and Tayuya could possibly die. Tsunade-sama, let me take your place. I don't have near as much chakra as you three, but you're almost at your limit. Any longer and you'll be putting your own life at risk. The Hokage frowned, but stood up. If she died, the entire village would be in a panic. When the older woman managed to regain her balance, Shizune settled herself down in her mentor's place and performed the seals necessary to continue the chakra transfusion. She probably wouldn't be able to last any more than 15 minutes or so, but as far as she was concerned, every little bit helped. 10 minutes later, Jiraiya stood up. His face was wet with perspiration, and unfortunately for Tayuya, the ceiling still had a quarter of the way to go. Ero Sennin, are you done too? Naruto asked, looking a little worried. He himself was nearly drained of chakra, and in another few minutes, he'd have to tap into the Kyuubi's power. The man sighed tiredly. Sorry, Naruto, I don't have as much chakra as I did in my prime. It looks like we'll have to rely on the nine-tailed fox after all, but try to hold out as long as you can. He walked over to the corner and leaned against the wall. He could feel his consciousness fading, but if nothing else, he wanted to stay awake long enough to see what effects the sinister chakra would have on her body. After a few minutes, Shizune leaned back onto her hands. She frowned apologetically at Naruto and Tayuya, but her reserves were nearly drained. It was now up to the blonde to finish it out. Unfortunately, he too had reached his limit. His breath was starting to come in short bursts as he fought to stay focused on holding in his prisoner's chakra. Finally, after fighting for another few minutes, he grudgingly closed his eyes and began to draw on the Kyuubi's chakra. The effect was immediate. The room was bathed in a bright red light, and the line of seals leading from Naruto to Tayuya looked to be aflame. Suddenly, her back arched off of the ground, and her mouth opened wide in a silent scream. Instead of following the predetermined path of the spiral, the burning chakra surrounded the girl and rushed into her body. Shit. Naruto, you're using too much chakra. Tsunade yelled, trying to move closer to Tayuya. Between the violent chakra and the girl's jerking movements, it was impossible to get any closer than 2 feet. I can't control it. It won't stop coming out. His eyes widened when dark laughter filled his head. He wildly looked around the room for the source of the evil chuckling. Have you forgotten our deal already, brat? Naruto blinked. He'd thought that visiting the Kyuubi was only a dream. Still, that didn't give the fox the right to hurt one of his precious people. What are you doing to her? Stop it. The Kyuubi snorted inside his head. Relax, boy, I'm doing her a favor. By now, the chakra was violently swirling around the room, forcing Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Shizune to shield their faces and lifting Tayuya almost a foot off of the ground. Judging by the look of immense agony on her face, it didn't look like he was doing her much of a favor. A favor? You're hurting her. Reconfiguring a human's DNA does that. Nani? For some reason, Naruto had the distinct impression that the beast was rolling his eyes. I swear, you humans have no sense of humor. Just trust me when I say that I'm helping you. The blonde narrowed his eyes suspiciously. It would be foolish to trust a demon, let alone a fox demon. Even though he was never allowed to attend story time with the other children at the orphanage, he was easily able to eavesdrop from the vents in the building's basement. There, he'd heard countless stories with foxes depicted as tricksters. They often played cruel tricks on their targets, leading travelers astray and stealing large amounts of food from poor farmers. On the other hand, the stories also said that kitsune always keep their promises, and could become trustworthy if treated with respect. Still, that didn't make him feel any less mistrustful. Helping me? Why, I won't mince words, you're weak. If you're weak, then the Akatsuki will have no trouble stealing and using me for their own power-hungry ideals. Since you're going to be with the girl for 3 years anyway, I might as well make her a little stronger too in case you happen to run into trouble. Think of it as self-preservation. I can't have you die until I figure out a way to escape, right? Besides, you can't stop me anyway. If you try to cut off the chakra flow to her body, there's no doubt that she will die. As much as he hated to admit it, the fox was right. Unable to do anything else, he watched Tayuya writhe and twist in the air, wishing more than anything that he could somehow hold back the Kyuubi's power. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the swirling red chakra shot straight up into the air and forced its way into her stomach. With the burning energy out of the way, Tsunade and Shizune rushed over to check her over. The Hokage removed the sheet and gasped. While the Sozo Seisei was originally meant to be placed on her forehead like Tsunade's, a larger, more intricate version now rested boldly on her abdomen. Jiraiya, she yelled, motioning for him to come over. When he arrived by her side, the man let out a surprised gasp of his own. This is amazing. The seal looks exactly how I drew it, but another seems to have been placed over it. He glanced over at his student. Naruto, do you know anything about this? Well, he started, trying not to look at the unconscious girl. The Baka Fox said something about making her stronger, but I don't know what he did. The black-haired medic frowned and edged her head to the side. That didn't sound like something a purely malevolent being would do. She watched with interest as the seal receded in on itself and formed a small purple jewel directly below the girl's belly button. Why? Naruto shook his head. I don't know, but is she okay? Did the seal work? Sighing, Tsunade placed the sheet back over Tayuya's body and picked her up bridal style. The bones feel whole again, but it's impossible to tell if the damage has been completely repaired until she wakes up. She placed her on a nearby stretcher and instructed her apprentice to take her to an observation room. We'll perform a few physical examinations to determine what effects the Kyuubi's seal had on her body. In the meantime, why don't you go buy her some flowers or something? I hear they help most patients recover faster. She turned her head away to hide her smirk. Naruto, of course, fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker. Really, I'll go get her some right now. He yelled, rushing out of the room. His movements were sluggish from the massive chakra exertion he'd been subjected to only a few minutes before, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. Shizune's eyes widened when the blonde rushed past her and Tayuya in nothing but a hospital gown. Wait, Naruto-kun, put on some pants. Yamanaka Ino was bored. Utterly, incredibly, stupendously bored. Only 2 people had come into the flower shop so far, one being her own mother to bring her lunch, and the other being the elderly woman down the street who stopped by every day to buy a single sunflower for her hair. Of course, that was to be expected. It was fall, and most of their business came from the spring and summer months. The only time people bought flowers this time of year was to either pick up a centerpiece for their dinner tables or to send flowers to a hospitalized friend. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, the amount of injuries also seemed to decline around this time of year. Despite the fact that they were on less than pleasant terms since they discovered their mutual interest in Uchiha Sasuke, her best friend and rival Haruno Sakura would usually stop by for an hour or two to chat and catch up on all the latest gossip. However, since Sasuke's defection from the Leaf, the pink-haired girl had been coming around less and less. Now that she was getting training from the Hokage herself, she hadn't been coming around at all. Sighing loudly, Ino boredly thumbed through her fashion magazine for what seemed like the 100th time that day. At that moment, she wished that someone, anyone, would come through the door of her family's flower shop, even if it was to rob the place. At least then she could enjoy kicking the thief's ass. As if Kami-sama himself had granted her wish, the bell hanging over the door chimed noisily. She immediately straightened herself up and opened her mouth to recite the store's customary greeting. Hi, welcome to the Yamanaka Flow. Oh, it's just you, the girl said, slumping her shoulders with disappointment. The customer angrily marched up to the register. What do you mean, it's just you? Ain't I a paying customer too? It's no wonder this place is so dead. With you behind the counter, I'm surprised the shop is still in business. Ino rolled her eyes and leaned forward on her elbows. What do you want, Naruto? No, wait, before you saying anything, I don't know where Sakura is. While she had gotten her wish, she wished that Kami-sama would have sent someone a little less annoying. Huh, oh, I didn't come here for that, he replied. She perked up a bit at his answer. The only time she ever really communicated with the boy outside of missions or group functions was when he wanted to know something about Sakura. Still, she was convinced that he was there for something involving her friend/rival. Really? Then what did you come here for? She noticed with some interest that he seemed a little hesitant to answer. After a few seconds of silence, he finally looked up to meet her eyes. I need to buy some flowers. Ino smacked her palm into her forehead. Of course. Sorry, we're out of miniature cherry blossom trees for the year. Come back in spring, if you really want one. Naruto gave her a confused look. What? So, I want to buy some flowers, not a Sakura tree. Geez, Ino, try to keep up. The girl edged her head to the side with confusion. Didn't he know that cherry blossoms were Sakura's favorites? She wouldn't be satisfied with anything else. Unless Sasuke gave them to her, anyway. Aren't you buying flowers for Sakura? She asked, her curiosity starting to get the best of her. No, when did I say that? Now, she was definitely curious. Well then, what are you buying flowers for? He nervously scratched the back of his head and avoided her invading gaze. She was starting to freak him out with her staring. Therefore, a friend. Look, I just need help picking some flowers because I don't know what any of them mean, okay? Ino's eyes widened to almost comical proportions. Naruto, the blonde, Sakura-obsessed fanboy, had finally moved on. This was the kind of gossip that girls, and a few guys, would give their right arm for. Determined to get some more information out of him, she quickly slipped around the counter and grabbed Naruto's hand, leading him towards the store's greenhouse. Most of the plants were arranged by name and lined the walls of the greenhouse, although the more popular flowers rested right at the entrance to the medium-sized room. There were flowers of all shapes, sizes, and colors all over the place, looking very much like a miniature rainforest. She pulled him inside the transparent building and closed the door behind her. All right, before we do anything, what are you planning to make? She asked, walking towards a large table in the corner. On top of it, there were various vases, colored ribbons, and tissue paper neatly arranged by size and color. Naruto stared after her with a dumbfounded expression. Make? He asked, following her over to the corner. She picked up a vase and a piece of tissue paper. Do you want to make a flower arrangement, or a bouquet? He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, carefully observing each choice. After a minute or two of silence, Ino sighed exasperatedly. Today, Naruto. Fine, fine. I'll take the tissue paper then. What color? She asked, turning to the wide assortment of hues. As soon as the words left her mouth, she immediately regretted her decision. She quickly turned back around and waved her hands in a disarming fashion. No, never mind. On second thought, I'll pick a color for you. Naruto grinned widely and nodded. That's a good idea. You'd know best. Anyway. Ino's hand froze in mid-grab. What did he mean by that? Shaking her head, she gathered up a couple of sheets of dark purple tissue paper and a long white strand of ribbon. Now, the fun began. So, Naruto, tell me about this person you're buying the flowers for. Is it a guy or girl? He narrowed his eyes suspiciously. He might act dumb 99.9% of the time, but even he could tell that she was up to something. Why does it matter? The girl cursed silently. Trust this to be the one time Naruto grows a brain. Why does it matter? She repeated, feigning shock. It's the most important thing in flower arranging. If you give a guy girly flowers, people might start questioning your ability. I mean, unless you really are. Just as she expected, the boy's eyes widened and he began to vigorously shake his head in disagreement. And no. No way. It's a girl, all right. He yelled, a slight blush appearing on his cheeks. To be honest, he didn't know why it was so embarrassing in the first place. He was just buying Tayuya some flowers to help her get better soon. While he was lost in his own thoughts, he missed the triumphant grin that appeared on Ino's face. Question a guy's ability, and they give up information faster than Choji can put away a full course meal. And that was pretty damn fast. Great. Now we're getting somewhere. Since it's a girl, let's start with some of these. Ino picked up a few small white flowers and set them around the edges of the tissue paper, which she had placed in a bouquet holder. She then picked up some small pieces of ivy and fern to add some contrast. Hey, that's pretty cool. You're really good at this, Ino. She felt her face grow slightly warm at the compliment. No one outside of her own family had ever commented on her flower arranging, and even though he was a complete idiot when it came to flowers, and a lot of other things, it still managed to make her feel somewhat happy. She smirked and rolled her eyes. We're not even close to done yet. Before we can get to the good stuff, you have to tell me a little more about this girl. What's she like? Naruto cast her a suspicious glare. Why does that matter? Expecting him to ask that question, she gave him the stupidest look she could muster. You really don't know. You have to pick flowers based on her personality, or the whole thing will clash and be a total failure. Naruto frowned deeply. There was no point in buying the flowers if they didn't work. When he looked up to think, Ino secretly covered her mouth to hold in a giggle. He was so gullible, it was almost a crime. She's kind of loud, he started, scratching his cheek. Ino immediately began thinking of all the girls that she and Naruto knew who fit into that category. Her eyes widened when she realized that only she, Sakura, and Amy fit into that category, and none of them had seen much of Amy since their academy days. Sakura was also out, since he'd clearly stated that he wasn't buying flowers for her earlier. That only left. What else? I can't tell a person's personality just from that, she stuttered. It wouldn't do any good to jump to conclusions, as there was a very good chance that he had friends she didn't know about, especially since they weren't really that close. Well, she can be really mean at times, and degrading too. Ino winced. But, I can tell that's not how she really is. I know that she cares a lot about others, even if she tries to hide it. She's also strong-willed and independent, and doesn't take shit from anybody. I think that's what I like about her the most. She gasped and blushed a mild crimson at his words. It was possibly the sweetest thing she'd ever heard, and what made it even more astounding was that it came from Naruto. The same boy that everyone called dead last, and idiot, had practically defined her in a short 4 paragraphs. Either she was as transparent as a sheet of glass, or he was much more insightful than he let on. Still, just to be completely sure. What do you think about her looks? She asked, trying her damnedest not to blush. Hey, I thought you said flowers were picked based on personality. They are. But, the color of the flower is picked based on her looks. She finished lamely. Damn it. There was no way he was going to fall for that one. He rubbed his chin in thought, slowly nodding his head as if understanding what she was talking about. Oh, I get it. He exclaimed, slamming his fist into his palm. Ino stared at him with disbelief. Just when she was starting to think that he might have some sort of brain in that big blonde head of his, too. She quickly regrouped and rested her hands on her ass impatiently. Well, I don't have all day. Naruto almost said something snide about the lack of customers he'd seen when he arrived, but decided against it this time. She was helping him out, after all. Okay, hold your horses, he sighed, assuming a thinking pose. A few seconds later, he smiled in an, aha, fashion. I don't care as much about her looks, but she's definitely in the top 10 of Konoha right now. Ino gasped. While she would prefer to be considered as number 1 in Konoha, she realized that he was trying to be as honest as possible in his description. It was hard to place her at the top when there was the Hokage and Kurenai to contend with. She glares at me a lot more than she smiles, but when she does smile, it's almost like she's a whole different person. By now, her face was practically the color of a tomato. She turned around and walked further into the nursery to hide her blush. "Nay, Ino, where are you going?" Naruto asked, starting to follow. Without looking back, she held out her hand to stop his advance. Just stay there, Naruto. I know exactly what she would want," she stuttered, tucking a persistent strand of hair behind her ear. His eyes lit up, and he nodded his agreement. This was going to be a whole lot easier than he thought. "Really? Thanks. I knew you were the right person to go to." She smiled softly to herself as she cut a few light red carnations away from the bush. That particular color represented admiration, and she knew without a doubt that admiration was one of the things he felt based on the fondness in his tone when he spoke of her. She continued on down the aisle, plucking various flowers from their stands. She picked flowers that represented love, hope, and adoration, while at the same trying to keep the bouquet within the boy's price range. Judging on his choice of attire and unhealthy obsession with ramen, he couldn't possibly have enough money to afford more than a dozen or so roses. While picking the flowers, she tried to make sense of her own feelings. For some strange reason, she could actually see him as a friend, and maybe even a potential boyfriend. They both had blonde hair and blue eyes, strong personalities, and he was always happy and supportive of his friends no matter what the circumstances. Of course, she'd have to change his wardrobe and eating habits, and maybe buy him a dictionary or two to expand his vocabulary if he wanted to date her, but that was something she could work on in time. Ino giggled to herself at how quickly her mind had accepted Naruto. She'd never thought much of him before today, as he was always considered the prankster, dead last, and idiot of the Rookie 9. Now that she thought about it, however, he was actually one of the strongest among them. In the Chunin exams, he'd managed to beat Inuzuka Kiba in the preliminary rounds. His method was a bit unconventional, but it had worked. He'd then gone on to beat Hyuga Neji, last year's Rookie of the Year, in the third round. She had been more than surprised when that had happened. How a fresh out of the academy, dead last idiot managed to beat a Hyuga genius with over 13 months of field experience was beyond her. Not only had he beaten some of the best genin Konoha had to offer, she'd also heard from Temari that he beat Gaara of the Sand. Sakura had at first said that Sasuke defeated him, but eventually admitted to being unconscious for the majority of the fight. Seeing as how Temari was actually awake and watching at the time, she'd been forced to believe the older Sand Nin. Initially, she'd been shocked. For a few weeks after the incident, she'd believed that Sasuke had done most of the work, and that Naruto simply came in for finishing blow. As time wore on, however, she had grudgingly begun to realize that the loudmouth genin was a lot stronger than he let on. Not even a week after his confrontation with Gaara, she heard from Shikamaru that Naruto had gone on a trip with Jiraiya, one of the legendary Sannin, to find the next Hokage, another one of the legendary Sannin. Once again, her world had been turned upside down. Just how did Naruto know one of the legendary three, and why was he allowed to accompany the man on his journey? There were so many questions surrounding the boy, yet she knew none of the answers. Ino bit her lip. Just who was Uzumaki Naruto? She'd have to pay a visit to Sakura sometime next week. She stopped in front of the large section of tulips, looking them over with a critical eye. They were a favorite among customers, as they weren't too romantic, too elegant, too bright, too big, or too small. They were simply perfect. She picked a few red tulips to complement the carnations she'd picked up earlier, and a few yellow ones to brighten up the arrangement. Yellow tended to mean cheerful thoughts and happiness, something that she thought fit the both of them. Ino snuck a peek at Naruto out of the corner of her eye. It didn't look like he had moved an inch from where she had left him, although sometime during her reverie he had unzipped his heavy orange jacket, revealing a tight black t-shirt underneath. His headband was tied around his neck for the time being, and she noticed with a small blush that he actually looked sort of cool with his bangs falling into his eyes. She vigorously shook her head, trying her hardest to get those thoughts out of his head. What the hell was she thinking? This was Naruto she was talking about. The dead last in the academy. The ramen freak. Sakura's self-proclaimed fanboy. Just because he had shown a little interest in her, she was acting like a civilian schoolgirl with a crush. It didn't make sense. Plenty of guys had approached her over the years, promising her love, fortune, and a life of comfort. So why was Naruto any different? Maybe it was different because it was Naruto. Maybe it was because the boy who had previously shown interest in Sakura now had a crush on her. In a way, she was stealing his affection from her rival, proving once and for all who was better. That had to be it. Or, maybe it's because he was Sasuke's best friend, making Naruto the closest link she has to the missing Uchiha. Or maybe. Ino shook her head again. These thoughts weren't getting her anywhere. Ah, Ino. Are you okay? The blonde asked, eyeing her with unhidden concern. She jumped slightly and turned back to the tulips in front of her. Sure. She laughed nervously and tucked a loose lock of hair behind her ear. Hey, Naruto-kun, can you come over here for a second? I need you to pick the main flower for the bouquet. He lifted an eyebrow at the addition of kun to his name, but walked over to stand next to her. Shouldn't you do this? I don't really know anything about flowers. She shook her head and smiled. I can't. This is your arrangement, so you have to pick the flower that most represents what you feel about the person you're giving it to. At his confused expression, she hung her head and sighed. On second thought, just pick whatever you think would look nice. His face immediately lit up. That, he could do. Ino watched with mild amusement as he raced up and down the aisles of the greenhouse, stopping for no more than 1 or 2 seconds at each group of flowers. Finally, after a few minutes of searching, Naruto appeared from around the corner with a single lavender rose. This one, he yelled, holding it up in the air. The girl smiled and plucked the flower from his fingertips. Even though he probably didn't know it, lavender roses usually meant things like love at first sight or enchantment. After placing the flower directly in the center of the bouquet, she tucked the same strand of hair behind her ear and turned to show him the completed arrangement. What do you think? Beautiful, right? He grinned foxily, fully exposing his unnaturally sharp canines. Yep. Next time I need to buy flowers, I'm definitely coming to see you. Ino blushed slightly and turned to walk back into the store. Just as they entered the main building, Naruto suddenly stopped and ran back into the greenhouse. Nay, Ino, hold on a minute. He called from among the flowers. She rested an impatient hand on her as she waited for him to reappear, curious as to what he was doing. Naruto-kun, what are you doing? As soon as the words left her mouth, the genin in question rounded the nearest shelf with a single white wildflower in his hand. He grinned sheepishly and scratched the back of his head. I just wanted to buy one of these, too. She raised her eyebrows at the flower, but shrugged and ushered him into the store. After walking behind the counter, she quickly rang up his order. Counting the wildflower, that'll be 1,850 yen. The boy's jaw dropped in surprise, causing her to frown and narrow her eyes. What? You can't afford it? No. It's just that the flower shop down the street is 5 times as expensive as this place. Ino blinked in surprise. The last time she checked, their prices were nearly the same. He quickly shuffled through his pockets and produced a few bills, placing them in the girl's outstretched hand. Here you go. You can keep the change as a tip. Ino blinked again. Since when did Naruto have enough money to give her a? She quickly glanced over the bills in her hand. 500 yen tip. Thanks. Here are your flowers, she murmured, still a bit awestruck. Maybe she'd underestimated the boy. Still, there was something that bothered her about this whole situation. Hey, Naruto-kun. When he looked up to stare at her, she continued. Instead of going through the trouble of buying flowers, why didn't you just tell me how you felt? The blonde tilted his head in the typical Naruto fashion. How I feel about what? He asked, obviously confused. She furrowed her brows and leaned forward to stare into his eyes. He wasn't getting away that easily. About me, idiot. Now, he was really confused. He had a curious eyebrow at her annoyed expression. What about you? Ino's eyebrow twitched. Either he was really good at playing dumb, or she'd made a horrible mistake in her assumptions. Unfortunately for him, she wasn't quite ready to admit that she was wrong. Taking a deep breath to calm herself, she slowly walked from behind the counter to stand directly in front of Naruto. She placed both of her hands on his shoulders and looked him squarely in the eyes. Naruto, she started, her expression deathly serious, how do you feel about me? Naruto shifted uncomfortably under her intense gaze. Her piercing sky-blue eyes showed visions of death and castration if he didn't answer her question correctly. Deciding to tread lightly, he gulped loudly and shifted his eyes away from her. Well, I think you're really smart and stuff and know a lot about flowers, he stuttered, trying to gauge her reaction. When her eyes narrowed, he quickly continued. And you're pretty. The girl's mouth twitched upward, causing him to let loose a small breath of relief. Maybe he could get out of this unscathed after all. And you're really nice for helping me pick these flowers for Tayuya. Her hands clenched painfully on his jacket-clad shoulders. Say that again, she ground out, her stare turning into a glare. Naruto thanked the gods that he had used the bathroom before he left the hospital. Why, you're really nice for helping me pick these flowers for Tayuya. I think they'll help her get better in no time. Ino slowly let go of his shoulders and took a few steps back. Oh, I see. While she was cool and composed on the outside, her insides were in turmoil. How could she have been so stupid as to assume that he would actually have a crush on her? They'd barely spoken in the 6 years that they've known each other, and he'd certainly never shown an interest in anyone except for Sakura. But, just who was this Tayuya girl he was buying flowers for? Frowning deeply, she slowly trudged back behind the counter and plopped down on the stool, leaning her chin on the palm of her hand. What the hell was she thinking? Naruto is her boyfriend. They would never work. She was a girl that demanded a certain amount of attention, and knowing his love for ramen and training, there was no possible way that he could give it to her. Ino thrust a persistent strand of light blonde hair behind her ear and nodded triumphantly to herself. He could never give her what she needed. He knew nothing about romance, and his fashion sense was simply atrocious. It would be better if she just admitted to herself that she'd let her boredom get the best of her, and forget that this whole entire thing ever happened. Suddenly, she felt something insert itself over her left ear. She blinked to see Naruto moving his hand away with a smile. There. Now that piece of hair won't bother you anymore, he exclaimed. He took a few steps back to admire his handiwork, putting on a serious face for effect. After nodding to himself a few times, he smiled and gave her a thumb-ups. Wildflowers really suit you, Ino-chan. Ino's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. She lifted her hand to feel the soft, willowy petals of the flower he had gone back to get only 5 minutes earlier. While the thumbs up had been extremely corny, really, who the hell did that anymore? His comment caused a light pink blush to appear on her face. She smiled bashfully and tried futilely to bring down the color in her cheeks. Thanks, Ino murmured. His smile widened into his trademark foxy grin, and with a small wave, he exited the store. Later, Ino-chan. For 5 minutes after he had gone, she stared at the clear glass door of the shop, unable to believe what had just happened. Not only had he done something extremely sweet and out of character, but he'd also managed to pick her all-time favorite flower. Sighing loudly to herself, she allowed her head to thump painfully against the countertop. Screw next week, she was going to pay a visit to Sakura tomorrow. There were many words that could be used to describe Orochimaru: evil, sinister, cruel, deceiving, snake-like. Hell, even why, in a sick, abnormally twisted sort of way. Patient was not one of them. Damn it, Kabuto, where are those two? They should have been back yesterday. Orochimaru yelled, his voice echoing in the large, dark throne room. Countless snakes slithered among the rafters, and human skulls lined the thick stone walls. The young man pushed his glasses further up on his nose before answering. Yoroi was spotted at the border to the Fire Country last night. Masumi was not with him. The Sannin hissed with annoyance. He thought the mission had been simple enough, but apparently, he'd thought wrong. Why was everyone in his village so incompetent? Where is he now? He asked, displeasure clear on his face. At that moment, the doors to the chamber slowly opened to reveal a sound Anbu officer. Otokage-sama, he started, bowing low to the ground. Akado Yoroi is here to see you. Shall I send him in? The Sannin's face visibly lit up, sending a small shudder through the Anbu officer. A smiling Orochimaru was never a good thing. After receiving a nod of confirmation from his leader, the shinobi quickly backed out of the room, only to be replaced by a thin, cowering man. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, and dark rings were prevalent beneath his eyes. What took you so long? The snake spat, staring down at the man with obvious disdain. The man quickly fell to his knees and placed his forehead against the ground. Please excuse me, Orochimaru-sama, I ran into some trouble on the way here. Relief flooded the man as the Otokage frowned but nodded his acceptance. It was difficult for even a Junin-level shinobi to cross the Fire Country's border undetected. Did you complete your mission? And where is Masumi? Yoroi froze and slowly lifted his head to look at the spot where he believed his leader to be. I don't know. The room was deathly silent for a few seconds. You don't know. The Sannin yelled. The man was visibly shaking, and unconsciously began to scoot backwards towards the entrance to the throne room. Visions of his life began to pass before his eyes as he realized what was about to happen next. Well, Masumi insisted that he be allowed to do the job on his own, and the girl was crippled from the waist down and there was just a blonde kid with H. A blonde kid? Orochimaru asked, cutting him off. Yoroi nodded from his position on the ground. Why yes, but he didn't seem like much of a threat. I believe Masumi said that he was going to kill him too, just in case. The room once again became silent as the Sannin and his second-in-command processed this information. There were hardly any blonde shinobi that Kabuto knew of in Konoha except for the Kyuubi container and those of the Yamanaka clan. It was possible the kid was a civilian, but it was highly improbable. Orochimaru-sama, could that blonde kid be Naruto-kun? Kabuto whispered from Orochimaru's right side. The Sannin remained quiet in thought for a few seconds before lifting his head to address his subordinate. What did you discover when you returned to check on your partner? Realizing that he wasn't going to die right away, the man sat back on his haunches to think. Well, there was no one there, but the ground was ripped up in a few places and a few trees had been broken in half. The area was also heavily guarded by a team of Anbu, so I couldn't get any closer to look for details. Interesting, the Otokage hissed, narrowing his eyes in thought. I suppose I can try to sense her presence to see if she's alive or not. For your sake, you had better hope that Masumi completed his mission. Orochimaru closed his eyes to concentrate. It was a simple task to sense the presence of those he had given the cursed seal to, and he could easily find any of them no matter where they were. Yoroi was waiting nervously for the results, hoping against hope that his friend and partner had somehow managed to finish the girl off. A few minutes later, the Sanin opened his eyes and smiled. It seems like you're allowed to live for the time being. The man's head snapped up with surprise. He had been completely sure that he was going to die at his master's hands. Orochimaru-sama, perhaps he managed to kill Tayuya first before being killed by the blonde. No matter, as long as the mission is complete. Leave me. Yoroi wasted no time in getting the hell out of there, and Kabuto noticed with some amusement that he had a large wet spot on the back of his pants. Are you worried about Naruto-kun? He asked in that infuriatingly smug tone of his. The Sanin chuckled evilly and shook his head. Why should I be? If he couldn't even stop that weakling Masumi from killing Tayuya, what kind of threat would he be to me? The silver-haired medic Nin nodded his agreement. Imagine if he and the girl had become friends. Then he'd have 2 reasons to seek you out. Orochimaru's maniacal grin widened. Let him come. If I kill the Kyuubi, the Akatsuki won't be able to succeed in their plans to use the 9 Biju. Are you sure that's wise? They'll come looking for you to extract their revenge. Ah, but by then, I'll have the Sharingan. Once I eradicate the Akatsuki, nothing will be able to stop me. His cackling echoed throughout the room, causing Kabuto to crack a small scheming grin of his own. If only he knew. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 birds, Hyuga Neji counted to himself. Things had been extremely quiet ever since he'd flown off the handle a few days earlier. Besides the daily visit from Guy, Lee, and Tenten, no one else had bothered to stop by for fear of extracting the Hyuga wrath upon themselves, which suited the stoic boy just fine. Everyone else was just an annoyance anyway. So it came as no surprise that Neji's eyebrows shot up into his forehead when the door to his hospital room slowly opened to reveal a small girl standing in the doorway. Hanabi-sama, he yelped, shock visible on his face. The girl stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. Ni-san, she said, nodding her head in his direction. He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position to address his younger cousin. Is there something wrong, Hanabi-sama? His face scrunched up with slight worry, a fact which many clan members would find amusing had they seen it. It was no secret to anyone that the genin used to despise the main family, although he'd recently been making an effort to be much more civil and kind towards his cousins. Hanabi slowly shook her head and raised it to look him in the eyes. No, nothing's wrong. At least, it's nothing serious. I think. Neji lifted a confused eyebrow. He'd never seen his cousin act so confused about something. Truly, whatever was bothering her must be serious. He attempted to smile comfortingly, although it came out as more of a painful grimace. Why don't you tell me what's bothering you, and I will do my best to help you if I can. She slowly nodded again and moved to stand at the foot of his bed. It's about Ne-san, the girl started, her face completely devoid of emotion. Hinata-sama, the genin was honestly surprised that she was coming to him about her sister. Usually she only wanted to ask for tips or advice about the Jiyuken style, never about anything personal. Hi, I saw her, touching herself, she explained, scrunching up her face in mild confusion. When I asked her about it, she refused to explain, and I don't think it's something that I should bother Otu-sama with. The elder Hyuga's jaw dropped, and his usually fierce eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. Hinata, the shy, sweet, peace-loving little girl he'd known for years. Impossible. Neji put on an amused smirk. His youngest cousin was obviously mistaken. Hanabi-sama, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Perhaps you only think you saw it. Hanabi shook her head. No, she was standing in front of her mirror doing things like this. The girl lifted her hands to her admittedly flat chest and began to move them in a circular fashion, attempting to emulate what she'd seen her older sister do a few days before. Neji's face turned a deep shade of scarlet, and he quickly turned his eyes away from his cousin molesting herself. Hanabi-sama, such actions are well below the standards of the Hyuga. He stuttered. She shrugged and moved her hands away from her chest. Well, I kind of figured that, but I just wanted to know what it does. Does it help your chest to grow bigger? I think it does, because Nei-san's chest is this big, she started, demonstrating her elder sister's size with her hands, and everyone else in the clan is only around this big. By now, blood was threatening to spew out of his nose like a running faucet, and with his last bit of consciousness, he slammed his head back down to the bed and closed his eyes. Find Tenten and have her explain it to you. She'd know better than I would. Hanabi's face lit up. You're right. Arigato, Nei-san. As soon as he heard the door click shut, he slowly released the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and pulled his pillow over his face. What Naruto said. Fate got great pleasure out of bending him over and raping him up the ass with the metal-spiked strap-on of destiny. He sighed and glanced out of the window again to calm his nerves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Goddammit. Sunlight streamed into the small, plain hospital room, jovially announcing the start of another day. Birds chirped merrily from their perches among the tree branches while shinobi and civilians alike began their morning routines. A particularly persistent beam of light landed squarely on Tayuya's sleeping face, rousing the girl from her well-deserved slumber and enticing a groan of agony from her throat. She attempted to open her eyes, but found with some annoyance that her eyelids were stuck together from nearly 24 hours of misuse. She reached her hands up to her eyelids and forcefully pried them open. That was a mistake. Ah, she yelled, slamming her palms over her highly sensitive eyes. Apparently she wasn't quite used to the light yet, and a direct shot from the sun didn't help the matter. After waiting a couple of minutes for them to adjust, she slowly opened her eyes again and smiled. It seemed like she'd survived the ceiling. She pushed herself up into a sitting position and looked out of the large hospital room window. Everything looked so much more vivid and colorful than she remembered, and she noticed with some interest that she could see every individual leaf on the trees standing proudly across the street. That regeneration seal was much more effective than she'd thought it would be. Yawning crudely, Tayuya stretched her arms high above her head and reveled in the satisfying pop of her bones realigning themselves. At the peak of her stretch, she froze. She slowly turned her head to see that her right arm was indeed completely healthy again, and with an aggressive fervor commonly seen in rabid animals, she threw the sheets off her bed to look at her legs. The long scars and gashes from her fight with Tamari were long gone, and to her surprise, so were all of the abrasions she'd received during her career as a shinobi. She sucked in a large breath of air and stared hopefully at her legs. This one moment would determine the course of the rest of her life. Either she would accompany Naruto on his 3-year training trip around the Eastern world and become a powerful kunoichi of the leaf, or she'd be confined to Konoha while her only acquaintance grew stronger without her. As if sensing her apprehension, the sun temporarily hid itself behind a large white cloud, and the birds quickly ceased their birdsongs to fly away and sing their morning tunes elsewhere. She let loose the breath she'd been holding and set her mouth into a firm line. With her eyes narrowed in concentration, she sent a subtle mental command for her legs to move. To her obvious relief, both legs levitated approximately 3 inches above the bed. Her frown turned into a grin, and soon, her smile was threatening to split her face in half. Yes, she screamed, swinging her legs over the edge of the mattress. Yes, 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 yes. She hopped off of the bed and stood on wobbly legs. Yes. I can walk. I can in. With a dull thud, Tayuya landed flat on her face. Biwahahaha. Naruto doubled over with laughter, holding his stomach to keep his intestines from falling out through his belly button. He'd been quietly observing her actions from the other bed in the hospital room, that is, until she fell. The girl groaned in pain and turned her head to scowl up at the laughing boy. "Stop laughing," she screeched, her face turning bright red with embarrassment and anger. Unfortunately, her words had the opposite effect. Instead of slowing down his laughter, he only laughed harder and was soon fighting desperately for air. "Yeah, right. What can you do from down there?" he gasped out between breaths, a wide grin still stretched over his face. She snarled and narrowed her eyes. Having had enough of his joking, she rolled herself over onto her back and held up a hand. "Shut the up and help me." Naruto took a few deep, calming breaths before nodding and making his way over to the redhead, still chuckling softly to himself. When he got close enough to pick her up, Tayuya quickly chopped him in the back of the knees, causing him to tumble clumsily towards the ground. Before he could catch himself on the cold tile floor, she grabbed his collar and pulled him directly on top of her. "You were saying, dipshit. Hey, no fair. You tricked me." He fought to get out of her grip, but found that the angry-looking girl was a hell of a lot stronger than she looked. They struggled viciously for a few minutes, pulling and tugging at each other to get the upper hand. Eventually, skill and experience beat brute strength and Tayuya ended up straddling the boy with a triumphant grin. "Ha, now that I have 2 arms, you don't stand a chance against someone like me." "What now, motherer?" she taunted, shaking his collar for good measure. Naruto turned his head away and sniffed indignantly. "Just get off of me already." She smirked and shook her head, flinging her long red hair around her face. "Not until you say that you give up." "No way. I never give up. That's my way of the ninja," he yelled, staring up at her with unbridled determination. The girl shrugged nonchalantly, completely brushing off his outburst. "Fine, but I'm not moving until you say it." "I'm not saying it." "Then don't." "I won't." "Fine. Fine." They sat there for a few more minutes in silence, Tayuya staring boredly into his eyes while he stared back with courageous vigor. Finally, Naruto lowered his eyes and sighed. "If I say it, will you really let me up?" She grinned and nodded. "I promise." With another sigh, the boy rolled his eyes and looked up at her with an obviously insincere expression. "I give up." "Happy. Now let me go." Her smile widened and she moved to get up. Unfortunately, she'd forgotten that her legs weren't exactly working. She managed to get a few inches off of his stomach before she ungracefully plopped back down, thoroughly knocking the wind out of her teammate. "Oof. What are you doing? Get off." Tayuya furrowed her brows and shot him a quick glare. "I'm trying, idiot." She attempted to lift herself off of him again, but only managed to achieve the same results. Naruto scowled and lifted his hands to help her. It was painfully easy to see that she wasn't going to make it on her own steam. The redhead swatted his hands away from her waist with a frown. "Don't help me, I can do it on my own." She again tried to stand, but only improved her previous record by another inch. "No, you can't. Let me help." "No. Yes. Here, just let me." "I said to let me do it." "But you can't." "Yes, I can. You're hurting me. Or all you Konoha ninja this whiny." "I can't help it. It hurts." "Just hold on a little longer. I can do it." "No, you can't. Just let me give you a little push." "I don't need your help, damn it. I'm almost there." "What about me? You're gonna kill me before that happens." "Cammy, suck it up already. It's too much." "Oh my." Both teens snapped their heads around to see Shizune staring wide-eyed from the doorway. Her knuckles were white from her tight grip on the doorknob, and a bright red blush accented her cheeks. It was hard not to be embarrassed by a previously crippled girl bouncing roughly on top of the boy she thought of as her little brother, after all. Her mentor walked up behind her and peered curiously into the room from over her shoulder. "What's wrong? Is she?" The Hokage stopped in the middle of her sentence, her jaw practically scraping the cold white tiles at her feet. In front of her were two panting, red-faced teenagers lying on the floor in an incredibly compromising position. Suddenly, all of the screams and yells she'd heard coming from the room made perfect sense. She slowly picked her jaw up off of the ground and regarded them with a calm expression. "Wow, brat, I didn't think you'd nail her that fast." They stared at her confusedly for a few seconds before exchanging puzzled expressions of their own. Being the faster of the two, Tayuya was the first to realize what the woman was trying to imply. Her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates and she opened her mouth to protest, stumbling over her words in the process. No, we weren't. That, she yelled, failing to form a complete sentence. Tsunade smirked and looked over at Naruto with a mischievous glint in her eye. Trying to get another peek. Naruto. An eerie silence filled the room as both genin stiffened at her question. A violent aura rose up from the girl in nearly visible waves of energy, scaring Naruto shitless and sending the birds singing merrily across the street into cardiac arrest. She mechanically turned her head to look at the cowering boy beneath her, a deep blush spreading over her cheeks despite her anger. "Another peek. Naruto," she started, her teeth grinding together with anger. "What the did I say I would do to you if you peeked?" The blonde grinned nervously and tried to ease his way out from under her, only to be grabbed by the collar and shoved roughly back against the floor. She reached for the weapons pouch on his right leg and grabbed a kunai before holding it high above her head with both hands. Realizing what she was planning to do, he quickly raised his hands in a disarming fashion, hoping to calm the demonic redhead down before she impaled him with his own weapon. Wait. He gulped, cringing expectantly. Tayuya snarled and raised the knife higher. No amount of begging and pleading could save him now. Ironically, he was hardly the first guy to have seen her since she joined Orochimaru. Her teammates had seen her on many occasions both on and off of missions, though they usually only commented on how short and pudgy she looked without any clothes on. Anyone else who happened to see her were promptly thrust into an A-ranked level genjutsu while being devoured by her summoned zombies. Though her mind vehemently denied it, she knew exactly why she didn't want Naruto to see her. Pushing those thoughts aside for the time being, she narrowed her eyes even further and clenched the kunai tighter in her hands. "You brought this on yourself, hentai." She brought the knife down at a blinding speed, watching angrily as Naruto tightly squeezed his eyes shut and braced himself for immense agony. Just as she was about to stab him between his beautiful, cerulean blue eyes, her hands suddenly swerved to the right, leaving a shallow cut on his whiskered cheek and embedding the weapon into the floor. "Goddamn it, you're so lucky you saved my life. If you were anyone else, and I mean anyone, I just want to, she screamed, fighting to keep her twitching hands away from the blonde's neck. At this point, it had become painfully clear to the other shinobi in the room that this girl was very mentally unstable. Naruto slowly opened one of his eyes to stare up at the fuming girl. It was obvious that her emotions were conflicted, and he watched with mild interest and fear as her face cycled between anger, agony, sadness, and another expression he'd never seen before. But mostly anger. Shizune stood behind the girl with a relieved expression on her face, holding a steadying hand over her heart. The Hokage just rolled her eyes and stepped into the room, closing and locking the door behind her. "If you two are done with your little lover's spat," she drawled, resting a lazy hand on her, "I'd really like to get this briefing over with." Tayuya's scowl deepened, and with a little help from Shizune, she got off of the boy and plopped down on her own bed. The boy wasted no time in scrambling to his feet and hiding behind the only other blonde in the room. She sighed and rolled her eyes again. Kids this young definitely shouldn't be shinobi. Shooting her surrogate little brother a withering glare, she easily flung him out from behind her and towards his own bed, which he landed harshly on with a loud grunt. "Hey!" he yelled, pushing himself up into a half-lying, half-sitting position. Aren't nurses supposed to be gentle with their patients? Tsunade frowned and shook her fist at Naruto. Shut up, brat. Or do you not want to hear what you'll be doing for the next few days before you leave? It was agonizingly difficult to keep a knowing smirk from spreading across her face. If you wanted Naruto to do something, all you had to do was dangle either a mission, new jutsu, or a piece of wanted information over his head. Predictably, the genin immediately shut up and sat up straight on the small hospital bed. A small twitch of her lips was the only sign she gave to show that she was pleased. That's what I thought. Now, Tayuya. The pouting girl lifted her eyes to look at the deceivingly young woman. You're probably wondering why you can't use your legs as well as you used to. When the genin nodded, Tsunade continued. Although the Sozo Seisei healed the muscles, bones, and ligaments in your legs, your muscles are still weak from the massive cellular multiplication needed to perform the jutsu. That, combined with the fact that you haven't walked in nearly 2 weeks, means you'll be confined to a pair of crutches until you gain your strength back. It should only take a couple of days, provided that you perform a few simple stretches every day and get a plentiful amount of rest every night. You'll be walking in no time. Tayuya slowly nodded her head, not daring to give away her excitement. If there was one thing that she'd learned in life, it was that karma was a bitch. How long until I can move like a shinobi? The woman frowned thoughtfully. I suppose that depends on you. Your legs are fully healed, so it's up to you to get them back in shape. The girl nodded again, this time allowing a small smile to inconspicuously slide onto her face. Getting herself back into shape would be a snap. On that note, Jiraiya wants to leave early on Friday morning. That gives you 3 days to get yourselves packed, say your goodbyes, and do whatever the hell else you need to before you have to leave. You're going to be gone for 3 years, make the most of your time here. Tayuya snorted rudely, but chose not to comment. The woman had to have been talking to Naruto since she didn't particularly care for anyone in the village at all, nor did she have much of anything to pack. Tsunade glanced up at the clock and smirked. By the way, you might want to get a move on. What? Why? Naruto asked, ing his head to the side. You have a mission, remember? Or did you forget? It was originally supposed to end this Friday, but since you need that time to prepare yourselves, today will be your last day. From what I hear, those kids have been mighty anxious for you to come back, something about a story. Both genin raised their eyebrows. The fact that a bunch of kids they'd barely known for 2 days wanted them to come back was nothing short of astounding. Still, it was a little flattering to be wanted so badly. The Hokage motioned for Shizune to follow her out of the room, in which the younger woman quickly obliged. Just as she opened the door, Tsunade suddenly stopped and glanced over her shoulder. By the way, as of 12 o'clock this afternoon, both of you are officially discharged from the hospital. Tayuya frowned curiously. Where am I supposed to stay until we leave? The large grin that suddenly sprouted upon the Hokage's face told her everything she needed to know. And no, hell no, you don't mean. That's right. There's no sense in wasting money on a hotel for only 3 nights, so you'll be staying with Naruto until this weekend. Have fun. And with that, she disappeared through the doorway. Shizune, on the other hand, at least had the decency to shoot them an apologetic smile before slowly slipping out of the room and closing the door behind her. For a good 5 minutes, neither of them moved. The two of them were still staring disbelievingly at the closed door, eyes wide and mouths open wide enough for 2 boss-level summons to fit inside. As if on cue, they simultaneously turned their heads to stare blankly at each other. We should leave soon, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. She noticed that his face was slightly paler than usual, and that small beads of sweat were beginning to pop up on his forehead. Still, she meekly nodded her head. You, want me to get your clothes? She nodded again, and with a speed easily comparable to a snail, Naruto rose from the bed and drifted over to the cupboards on the other side of the room. After grabbing all of the garments folded neatly on the bottom shelf, a dark blue long-sleeve shirts, a pair of black ninja pants, and a pair of ninja sandals, he stiffly handed her the items and walked out of the room. It was going to be a long 3 days. Tsunade-sama, Shizune called, racing after her mentor. They'd just left the hospital room of Naruto and Tayuya, and were currently on their way back to the Hokage's office. The older woman slowed down her pace to allow her to catch up. "What is it?" she asked as they walked out of the hospital. "Why didn't you tell her about you-know-who's changes to the seal?" Tsunade shrugged. "I can tell her later. Besides, don't you think it'd be more fun if she was able to find out about the changes herself?" she said, grinning conspiratorially at her assistant. Shizune frowned and shook her head. "But don't you think that's a little irresponsible? What if there's a problem?" The Hokage waved her hand dismissively as they entered the Hokage Tower. Thankfully, it was very close to the hospital, allowing her to go from place to place in seconds if she so chose to. "You worry too much. Even if something did happen, the brat never leaves her side. She'll be fine." Her frown deepening, Shizune crossed her arms and stopped at the foot of the stairs leading to the Hokage's office. "This isn't your way of getting revenge on her for calling you a decrepit old hag, is it?" The small jump of Tsunade's shoulders gave away her surprise at being discovered so easily. "Geez, what is this? 20 questions. Don't you have to take Taunton for a walk or something?" The black-haired woman sighed in disappointment. She could be so immature sometimes. "Tsunade-sama, not only are you the head doctor of the hospital, but you're the Hokage of the Leaf Village. Don't you think you should be a little more considerate towards the feelings of your patient and subordinate? I can't believe that you're withholding information from Tayuya just because she insulted something as superficial as your age. I'm very disappointed in you." She stamped her foot to emphasize her point, looking very childish herself. Tsunade simply stood at the top of the stairs, not bothering to answer nor give any signal that she'd heard the lecture. Shizune's frown deepened, and she quickly walked up the stairs towards her mentor. She reached her hand out to tap the woman on the shoulder. "Tsunade-sama, did you hear?" Amazingly, her hand went straight through the woman's chest. Immediately after, the Hokage slowly dissipated into nothing. Shizune cursed under her breath. Bunshin no Jutsu, one of the simplest ninjutsu known to the shinobi world, and she'd fallen for it. Just as she was about to scale the rest of the stairs to give her mentor a piece of her mind, her frown suddenly turned into a mischievous smile. It was obvious that words alone wouldn't help the blonde understand what she was trying to say, so she was going to have to scold her through actions. Chuckling evilly, she crept back down the steps and out of the building. This was going to fun. Tayuya sighed as she straightened the dark blue shirt resting loosely over her torso. Less than half an hour into the day and she was already stressed out beyond belief. She was certain that karma was collecting on its long overdue rent, or perhaps things like this only happened when Naruto was around. A shallow blush appeared on her face as she thought about the blonde idiot. She was still pretty pissed off that he'd peeped on her while she was unconscious, and probably lying spread eagle on the floor of the operating room. Growling lowly, she easily tugged the dark pants up her legs and buttoned them at the top. Yes, he would pay. She would make sure of that. After grabbing and securing her ninja sandals, she reached for the small mirror and brush sitting on the small table next to her bed. To her surprise, they were right underneath a huge, colorful flower arrangement. She gawked at the flowers for nearly a full minute, unsure if whether or not they were actually there or if she just was experiencing a bizarre side effect of the ceiling. How the did I miss those? She wondered aloud, still staring dumbly at the flowers. Shuffling towards the head of the bed, she leaned forward and made her second big mistake of the day, taking a huge, uninhibited whiff of the sweet-smelling plants. The effect was immediate. Her eyes began to water as she choked and gagged from the unusually strong smell, and it took another good minute for her to shuffle over to the window and open it to get some fresh air. She took a few more deep breaths before turning to glare at her current ire. "Ing flowers," she spat, still gasping for air on the bed. "I should throw you bastards out the window for trying to kill me." Just as she was about to make good on her threat, she noticed a small piece of paper sticking right out of the middle of the arrangement. Curiously, she reached over and plucked it out with careful hands, handling the paper as if it would crumble if she was too rough. She slowly unrolled the piece of paper and glanced over the contents. There wasn't much of a message, just a simple, "Get well soon." However, it was the small picture at the bottom that caused a warm feeling to spread throughout her chest. Someone had drawn a chibi Naruto smiling with that foxy grin of his. He was holding up 2 fingers in the customary peace sign, and there were even tiny fox ears drawn in with a red pen. She smiled softly to herself. It was the first time she'd ever gotten flowers. Tayuya was by no means a flower expert, but she did learn some of the basics from her grandmother before she'd left to join Orochimaru. She turned a critical eye upon the arrangement. It was painfully obvious that he'd had some help with the bouquet, as it was much too neat and orderly for him to have put it together by himself. Hell, if it was up to him, he'd probably just fill the tissue paper with as many orange flowers as he could find. She inched closer to observe each and every individual petal, something that she found extremely easy to do ever since her operation. Remembering something her grandmother had told her when she was young, she decided to start at the edges and work her way in. The first layer of flowers were simply tiny white baby's breath, customary for any arrangement to add that subtle sparkle. A small amount of fern and ivy helped them stand out more against the edges, and looking a little closer, she noticed that there were even a few purple baby's breath flowers thrown in to subtly accent the tissue paper. There was now absolutely no doubt in her mind that this was done by a professional. Moving on, she trailed her amateur eyes over to the next group of flowers. These were more like the side dishes, used to build the viewer up until they could get to the center. There were mostly different colored tulips in this area, and she struggled to remember what each color meant. She easily remembered that yellow tulips represented happiness and cheerfulness as they had been her grandmother's favorites, but the other colors were puzzling her to no end. The red tulips could possibly mean things like love or admiration, but Naruto didn't seem to have those kinds of feelings for her at all. Deciding she'd put it off long enough, she lifted her eyes to view the main attraction. What she saw caused her breath to hitch painfully in her throat. In the center of the multicolored and extravagant arrangement was a single purple rose, proudly standing out amongst the much louder and plentiful tulips. It clashed so violently with the rest of the flowers that Naruto had to have been the one to choose it. An expert would never make such a juvenile mistake. Still, roses were the universal language for love, no matter what the color. Did that mean? She frowned a bit at the thought of him actually being in love with her. The idea itself wasn't so bad, but what could she say to that? Sure, she liked him well enough, but having him as a boyfriend? Even if she tried, she couldn't see herself actually skipping through a field of daisies with him, holding hands like old lovers and smiling at each with heartfelt desire. She'd shoot herself if she ever seriously pictured such a sickeningly sweet and cliché scene. No, if he was actually in love with her, she'd have to reject him, for both their sakes. Still, Naruto was dumber than a rock, and it was highly unlikely that he purposely chose a flower meant to express an emotion as strong as love. Knowing that idiot, he probably grabbed the prettiest looking thing he could find. He was simply showing her an act of goodwill by bringing her flowers, completely unaware that each individual flower had an actual meaning. She nodded forcefully to herself. That had to be it. Nodding again, she grabbed the crutches resting against the bed and slowly hefted herself into a standing position. Maybe she could forgive the idiot after all. She picked up her brush from the side table and quickly ran it through her long red hair. It was much longer than she liked it, reaching just past her shoulder blades. A haircut would be needed sometime within the next couple of weeks. She briefly glanced in the mirror again before slipping both items into her pocket and heading towards the door, but not before plucking the violet rose out of the bouquet and slipping it one of the lower pockets of her pants. Putting on a small smile, she placed her hand on the doorknob. Naruto, did yo? Tayuya started, opening the door. She watched dumbfounded as Naruto came tumbling headfirst into the room. After a few seconds, he picked himself up off the ground with a sheepish smile and began to nervously scratch the back of his head. Hey, Tayuya, he said, forcing a smile onto his face. She stared down at him with a blank expression. All feelings of thankfulness were long gone, being replaced by an empty void known as white-hot rage. What the were you doing? The girl asked, her voice neutral. Had he been a smart or insightful young man, Naruto would have taken off towards the nearest invasion shelter the moment she'd laid her eyes upon him. Unfortunately for him, he was neither. Well, I heard you screaming and coughing, and I got worried, so I was trying to hear if you were okay, and then it got quiet so I opened the door to see if. At that moment, Tayuya brought her left crutch down hard upon his head, sending him sprawling against the opposite wall. The blank, slightly curious expression was replaced by unbridled womanly fury, and if one looked closely, they could literally see the flames of hell burning within her eyes. You just don't learn, do you? She ground out through clenched teeth. Her crutch was poised high above her head for another strike, and he briefly wondered who would get all of the ramen stashed away in his cupboards if he should die here. Fearing for his life, Naruto did the only thing a true man could do in this situation, he begged. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to peek, I swear. I was just really worried about you and thought you were in trouble. Please don't kill me, he cried, staring up at her with wide, innocent blue eyes. She slowly felt her anger fading as she stared into his deep blue eyes, and gradually, she loosened her grip on the small wooden crutch and lowered it back to her side. You looked in because you were worried. Her eyes still stared angrily into his, despite the crumbling of her resolve. When he vigorously nodded his head to show his agreement, she sighed deeply and hung her head. Goddamn him and those beautiful persuasive blue eyes of his. That had to be some kind of kinjutsu used to break even the fiercest of shinobi. Idiot, she said, bopping him over the head again for good measure, just ask next time. Okay. Realizing that he got to live for another day, he shot up from his position on the ground and flashed her a foxy grin. Okay. Tayuya rolled her eyes at his enthusiastic response but couldn't keep a small smirk from making its way onto her face. Quit fooling around and let's go. If we're late, I'm telling the little it's your fault. That got him moving. He still had vivid memories of having his most intimate parts trampled by a large horde of bloodthirsty demonic minions. Ino-chan. The pink-haired woman stared down at the young kunoichi with more than a little bit of shock. The last she'd heard, Ino and her daughter had been bitter rivals, fighting over the now missing Uchiha. The girl smiled up at her apologetically. No doubt the woman knew of their rivalry, so it was a little awkward to suddenly show up on her doorstep after nearly 2 years of absence. Ohio, Haruno-san. Long time no see. Is Sakura home? She asked, trying to keep her voice light and innocent. True to her word, the blonde had decided to visit her old friend first thing in the morning to discuss the hyperactive ramen freak. She was a little tired, having spent most of the night coming up with ways to ask about Naruto without letting his teammate catch on to her intentions. Maybe because she was embarrassed to be even considering Naruto as something more than a friend, or maybe because she was afraid that Sakura would try to beat her to him. She almost smirked at the thought. Sakura interested in Naruto? Not likely. especially since Sasuke had only gone missing a couple of weeks earlier. Unlike herself and the other fangirls, Sakura seemed to hold a genuine love for the dark-haired boy, and the chances of her even thinking about moving on were slim to none. Yes, come in. Maybe you can help to get her out of this little funk she's been in lately. Ino's eyebrows shot up. She's still crying about Sasuke. The woman sadly shook her head. In a way, I wish she was. Then I'd at least know what was bothering her. She motioned for the girl to follow her up the stairs. She suddenly came home in tears a couple of days ago and ran straight up to her room. I haven't seen much of her since, except for when she leaves to train with Hokage-sama and comes back home again. She won't even come down for dinner anymore. The blonde frowned. That wasn't like Sakura at all. She glanced at the pictures on the wall leading up to the second floor. The entire wall was filled with pictures of the pink-haired Kunoichi at different stages of her life, ranging from newborn to teenager. A sad smile fluttered over her lips at the pictures of herself and Sakura smiling at the camera like the best of friends, and she couldn't help but wonder why they'd let something as small as a childhood crush come between them. Shaking her head, she continued up the steps until they reached the door that was quite obviously Sakura's. It was decorated with large, heart-shaped sakura petals and countless pictures of the wayward Uchiha. Ino felt herself throw up a little in the back of her throat. Her love for Sasuke was bordering on psychotic obsession. Sakura-chan, honey, you have a friend here to see you. The woman called through the door. She waited a few seconds for an answer, but when it became obvious that she was being ignored, she slightly hung her head and sighed. I'm sorry, Ino-chan, just go right in. I believe you know how to get past the lock. Ino nodded and stepped up to the door. Just as she was about to perform the necessary actions, her hand suddenly stopped in midair and she turned to address the woman waiting anxiously at her side. Ah, Mrs. Haruno, Sakura didn't want me to show you how to do it, so. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll get out of your way. She backed away from door and hurried back down the stairs. After making sure that she was really gone, Ino took a deep breath and faced the door again. First, she banged the area above the doorknob twice and twisted it to the left once. Then, she kicked the bottom of the door 3 times, the wall next to the door hinge 4 times, and finally twisted the knob approximately 360 degrees to the right. The girl smirked when she heard the familiar click of the door being successfully unlocked, and easily swung it open with a boisterous sweeping motion. Oi, Sakura, what are you doing inside on such a beautiful day? She teased, stepping into the dark room. She stalked over to the window and forced the sunlight obstructing curtains open. Taking a quick surveying look around, she noticed that the room was terribly messy, clothes strewn about carelessly all over the place and used snack wrappers littering the floor. Well, at least she wasn't starving herself. She poked at the noticeable bulge sticking up from the bed with her finger. Hey, did you hear me? Get up. An annoyed grunt resounded from the mass of blankets. Go away, Ino, I don't feel like talking today. Ino frowned and plopped down on an unoccupied corner of the bed. Too bad, I do. With a forceful pull, she tossed the blankets off of the pink-haired genin and onto the floor. Ino, I'm serious, go away. Sakura yelled, turning away from the blonde. She only wore a simple pair of black sweatpants and a large pink t-shirt, and her short pink tresses were strewn about over her large puffy pink pillow with a blown-up picture of Sasuke screen printed on it, of course. No, look, either you get up right now, take a shower, and change clothes or I do it. The girl suddenly stiffened and slowly turned her head to meet the mischievous blue eyes of her former best friend. You wouldn't. Ino's grin widened. I would. Sakura's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. You don't have the guts. The blonde's smile widened to nearly impossible proportions, and with the loudest and most annoying voice she could muster, opened her mouth and began to sing. If you wanna be my lover, you gotta get with my friends, Make it last forever. Friends never EENDDSS. If you wanna be my lover, you have got to give. Taking is too easy, but that's the way. Enough. I give up, she screamed, desperately clawing at her ears with her fingernails. Why did you have to go there? Are you trying to permanently damage my ears? Ino idly scratched at her ear with the fingernail of her pinky and shrugged. Hey, you had your chance. Don't blame me. Grumbling, Sakura rolled out of bed and grabbed a few bits of clothing off of the floor while her rival watched with an amused smirk. She then stalked out of the room, and 15 minutes later, returned looking much better than she had when she'd left. There, happy, she growled, angrily plopping down in her desk chair. Ino smiled and nodded. Don't you feel so much better now? Sakura crossed her arms and shot her a dark glare. What do you want, Ino? The teasing smile immediately dropped from the blonde's face as she remembered why she'd come in the first place. She lowered her eyes in thought, trying her hardest to remember the lines she'd rehearsed the night before. After a few seconds of thought, she gave up and decided to wing it. Her best bet was to get her guard down, and establish some sort of mutual trust between them. With that thought in mind, she lifted her head and put on a concerned expression. Nothing much, just wondering why you're acting all depressed and moody. Does it have to do with Sasuke? She asked, feigning interest. To be honest, she couldn't care less about her rival's problems. 9 out of 10 times it had something to do with Sasuke, and one could only listen to the same old story 100 or so times before becoming fed up. She fought the urge to roll her eyes when the girl nodded. Kind of. How do you know? Ino's eye twitched with annoyance. Gee, I don't know, maybe because it's always about Sasuke. She thought. Instead of voicing her opinion, she smiled cheerfully and gave her a knowing smile. I can see it in your eyes, of course. Bullshit. So, what's the problem this time? Sakura sighed softly. Well, actually, the problem's mostly with Naruto. Ino blinked in surprise. Perhaps this was something worth listening to after all. Naruto? She asked, leaning forward on the bed. Sakura nodded and scowled. Yeah, he's hiding the identity of one of the shinobi who kidnapped Sasuke. The blonde's eyebrows shot up into her forehead. What? I'm serious. Remember that redhead we saw when we visited Naruto's room? She actually works for Orochimaru. I bet her name isn't really Tayuya, either. Can you believe he hid something so horrible from the entire village? He even lied to my face about it. Ino lowered her eyes and looked away, immediately piquing Sakura's curiosity. Ino. Yeah, I can't believe he'd do something like that. In reality, Shikamaru had already filled her in on the situation. Well, she'd actually had to beat it out of him, but she preferred to overlook such unimportant details. It was extremely easy to see that there was something fishy about the redhead. When they'd all entered the room, both Choji and Kiba had reacted powerfully to her presence. The fact that her teammate had to shut them up only cemented her suspicions. Sakura's theory did serve one purpose, though, she now knew the face of the one Naruto was buying the flowers for. You know something, don't you? Sakura asked, standing from her seat. When her rival shifted uncomfortably on the bed, she rushed over to grab the girl by the shoulders. Did Naruto help her kidnap Sasuke? I bet he did. He's always been jealous Sasuke and Ai's relations. That did it. Ino's eyes narrowed into angry slits as she too shot up from her seat to stare her fellow kunoichi straight in the eyes. Surprised, Sakura took a small step back. Shut the hell up. I can't believe you'd even think of something so outrageous about Naruto. He's been nothing but kind and loyal to you, and yet you suspect him of kidnapping Sasuke. Exclamation mark. He's your teammate, for Kami's sake. Why don't you use what's behind that billboard brow of yours and think for a change? Sasuke left, Sakura, and no matter what you may come up with in that arrogant, hoity-toity head of yours, that fact will always remain true. Both girls stared into each other's eyes, Sakura in definite shock and Ino in furious anger. After nearly a full minute of tense silence, the pink-haired genin finally composed herself enough to speak. "Get out," she hissed, her bangs covering the majority her eyes. Ino snorted and turned on her heel, making a beeline towards the door. She didn't know why she'd flown off the handle like she did, but she was confident that she would have defended any of the Konoha 11 in the same way. None of them, especially not the perpetually cheerful and honest Naruto, deserved to be accused of something so idiotically unsubstantial. Pulling the door open with as much strength as she could muster, she shot one last glare over her shoulder at her former friend and rival. Gladly, she slammed the door and stomped down the stairs, completely brushing off Sakura's worried and overawed mother. As far as she was concerned, that bitch deserved to wallow in her shallow pool of self-pity. 5 seconds after Ino had walked out of the door, Sakura fell to her knees and cried.